And look, I think this is a very interesting sort of setup we wanted to have because this is the one and only debate that we're going to have today at On-Chain 2025. And it's on the very apt topic of TradFi versus DeFi, which is more trusted. I can't think of a better person to do this with me than Eli. So before we get started, maybe Eli, you want to give a quick introduction of yourself and we can jump right into things.
Sure, thank you very much, and really good to be here. I'm Eli Cohen, I'm the general counsel at Centrifuge, which is a RWA tokenization platform. I think probably the oldest RWA tokenization platform. And I've been in the space in crypto since 2017, 2018, but also had about 20 years in TradFi, so I could actually take either part of the debate, but we're going to be nice to Chin and give him the TradFi.
Yep, because it wouldn't be fun if you're just debating with yourself, right? Look at it bipolar.
We can switch halfway through.
We can switch. But I'll start off first and sort of set some context for this debate. Look, I think when we talk about financial systems, the one thing that remains the most important is trust, right? Trust underlies everything that we do, regardless of whichever side you're on. But how it's earned, how it's tested, how it's measured, is clearly very different between TradFi and DeFi. Now, what we're going to ask today, it's really which is more trusted, TradFi or DeFi? And I think for the purposes of this debate, I'm going to take the position of TradFi, and Eli is going to take the position of DeFi. So I'll start first, and Eli, feel free to jump in, right? Yeah. To me, what stands out about trust, it's its ability to withstand the test of time. And I think that's something that the TradFi system has proven time and time again for decades. And yes, much of what has been said earlier is that TradFi is slow, but I would argue that sometimes that slowness to change, it's a feature, not a bug, because slow creates stability. You don't want your bank to be changing their policies every other week, and then you try to figure out what to do. So what do you have to say in response to that?
Well, yeah, it withstood the test of time. I mean, I think you could turn that quite around and think about what is the history of TradFi and all of the things that do happen in TradFi, the global financial crisis. We had 3 major bank insolvencies in the United States. You have all kinds of issues with compliance on a number of banks, HSBC in Mexico taking briefcases full of money, Wells Fargo in the United States creating fake accounts for their clients so they could run up their fees. There's a lot of things in TradFi, if you look at the details of that history, that are not necessarily so savory. Yep. And I think crypto and DeFi is a reaction to that. I think many people would prefer to control their own finances, and the democratization element of the DeFi protocols and the democratization element of crypto is really what is so attractive about it. I would trust myself over trusting trusting regulators who may be, as they said earlier today, asleep at the wheel.
That seems to be the phrase that's catching on. But maybe sort of just building off that point and sort of just taking a different look. What is clear, it's bad things happen.
Yes.
In TradFi, in DeFi.
That's right.
I think the biggest question is, in TradFi, when bad things happen, you have someone to turn to. And usually what that means is you have the regulator to turn to. You have someone who can come in to say, stop right there, let's reverse the transaction, let's freeze funds because this person stole your money. But you can't really do that in DeFi, can you?
Well, you can, to a certain extent. I mean, I think that the way that DeFi is organized is that all of those things should be happening automatically. You know, you've got smart contracts that control the liquidations for margins. You don't have to have a broker call you up and say, oh, you need to post margin today. It happens automatically. It's much faster and it's much more efficient that way. So you don't need to rely on the regulators. You do need to monitor your own wallets, of course. So you need to rely on yourself. But you know, the regulators may be not paying so close attention. As I said, I mean, look at the case of Bernie Madoff and that fraud that lasted for 20 years, and the regulators were aware of it and advised about it, and they still didn't do anything at all.
True. But let's also talk about consequences, because the nice thing about the the judicial system we have, it serves a very large disincentive for bad behavior to happen.
That's right.
For example, what's stopping me from going out and stealing someone's wallet? It's knowing the fact that the risk reward just doesn't make sense, right? In exchange for maybe $200 in a wallet, I'm looking at 5 to 7 years in jail. it just doesn't seem attractive, and therefore I think it incentivizes the large majority of people to behave well.
That's right.
Now, in DeFi, you don't really have that, right? You could argue that it's the wild, wild west, and that's what some people have said. So what do you say about that?
I don't think it's the wild, wild west. I mean, I think you do have that. I think you do see cases. We see litigation cases. You see, obviously you don't have a regulator, and it's not a regulated environment as you would have in TradFi, but it doesn't mean it's a lawless environment. There is theft, and people do get prosecuted for theft. You have, Tether freezing people's wallets if they think that there's North Koreans behind it. There is a level of law being enforced even in the DeFi environment, even if it isn't to the extent of a regulated bank.
Makes sense. And let's talk a bit about responsibility. What happens? Who is responsible?
That's right.
I think in many of the processes in traditional finance, the reason why it's so slow is because you just have to go through so many layers, right?
That's right.
Any transaction needs multiple sign-offs, multiple layers, but those layers, firstly, it's a check and balance, but I think secondly, you have names, you have individuals who are held liable and responsible should something go wrong. Now in DeFi, I hear your argument that code is law, everything is transparent, it's immutable, but then when something goes wrong, who should take responsibility?
Yeah, you have to take responsibility for that yourself. I mean, that's the thing about DeFi. I mean, do your homework, right?
Yep.
Do your own research. That's part of the ethos of the crypto markets, and I prefer that. I think that a lot of people prefer that. It's not for everybody, for sure, but I think a lot of people would say that if you want to have to rely on somebody, why not rely on yourself? And then if something goes wrong, well, you made the wrong decision, and you can learn from it, right? Otherwise, you're blaming somebody else, and you don't really know what went wrong, and there's no transparency, and you don't know what sort of operational error occurred that made you lose whatever your TradFi securities, and then you can't even learn from it because you don't even know what happened.
That's fair, but I would say that this yourself, and also most of the audience here, it's a biased crowd.
Yes.
What I mean by biased crowd is firstly, you're well informed, you're well educated, you usually come from a certain social economic background, which is fair. And I think in most places, what they would call this by regulatory means, it's you are accredited investor, you are, all of that, right? And so therefore, your ability to manage it by yourself, it's fine. You know the risks, you are prepared for it.
Correct.
Now we're talking about, let's say, the bottom half of the curve, right? Who perhaps the mass adoption that we're talking about.
Yes.
Like, wouldn't you say a lot of them are relying on regulators to protect them because perhaps they don't have access to information, access to the knowledge that perhaps we are fortunate to do, and this is just because of various conditions they're in, right? They could be in a tier 3 city in a place like Indonesia where even getting a stable connection to the internet is hard, and then suddenly someone tells them, sign up for this wallet, sign up for this DeFi protocol. They don't know better, they see a high attractive yield, they think that's good, and then something bad happens. So how do you think about that part about getting other people to accept and embrace that responsibility?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, there is probably a segment of the population that is better off remaining in TradFi. I wouldn't say that the DeFi is for 100%, but I mean, I think that obviously in TradFi you also have different players who are running scams, who are banks that are signing people up for services and for investments that are not suitable for them. So I think there's risks, for investors, for unaware investors, both in TradFi and in DeFi. I don't think that's something unique to DeFi, and I think that to the extent that you decide to self-select yourself rather than regulators select yourself to be a part of the DeFi environment, then you feel like you've got the comfort level to do that. I mean, otherwise it's the regulators stepping in and saying that you need X amount of money or you need to do this compliance course or whatever, and maybe that's helpful or maybe it's not, but it's not necessarily a sign of whether you're smarter enough to do those investments just because you have X amount of money.
Fair. Now let's talk about when these black swans event happen, the negative happens, or crudely put, when shit hits the fan, right?
Right.
Look, we acknowledge that happens in both TradFi and DeFi. The difference is in TradFi, you have someone coming in to say, this is how we're going to make improvements, this is how we're going to change the regulations. For example, after the 2008 crisis, the way financial instruments are structured radically change in terms of regulations.
Right.
who is playing that role in DeFi? How do you see that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I would say two things. I think that one of the reasons why you need the regulators and you need central banks to be able to step in the TradFi is because of something called systemic risk, right?
Yep.
Because once one bank goes down, that can have a chain reaction to a bunch of other TradFi players, brokers, and exchanges. So you need the government to come in and step in and bail somebody out. But DeFi being so diffuse and so so democratized, you could have FTX, for example, go down, and everybody else is fine. There's no systemic risk. There was no real knock-on effects of large issues in the DeFi yet. Maybe that will happen when things are more integrated, but it's a bit too early to say. We don't have the kind of history that you have in TradFi. But I think in general, the separation and the number of different players in the DeFi world will create less risk of a black swan event in the first place, rather than forcing taxpayers who were uninvolved to finance bailouts of banks who took risks that they were not supposed to take or should not have taken.
Right. And so who do you think learns faster?
Well, I definitely think that crypto learns faster. I mean, we can already see that, I think in terms of speed of learning, the people who are involved in the crypto space are looking every day. Every day things are changing, every day things are moving. There are so many new projects launching with so many new ideas and so many different types of technology. In the TradFi world, it's very step by step by step. And, a lot of people who work in TradFi will say that, oh, it's really compliance that's running this bank, and there's some truth to that, right? They can't move fast because they have to look to their regulators. They have to check everything with the regulators. They have to build for their compliance departments. So, just by definition, I think they can't move that fast.
That's fair, but I would also argue that this delay, this time, is exactly what helps to build trust. For example, today, if I come on stage and you meet me for the first time and I say, trust me and invest half of your net wealth with me, chances are you're going to say, I don't know you, who are you, right? But imagine if, let's say, we have this conversation, we get to know each other for a good 6 months, even better, 6 years. I think the ability for you to, let's say, trust me for something, it's going to be a lot higher, right? And so so how do you think, isn't it a losing game for DeFi? Because TradFi already has centuries or at the very least decades of sort of trust building that it's way ahead of DeFi. So yes, DeFi can continue to build trust, but it's just like that gap is always there.
Right, but what are the opportunity costs missed for waiting 6 years to make an investment, right? I mean, I think that people who participate in DeFi, people who participate in the DAOs, learn a lot about those particular protocols, a lot more than you'd ever learn about a bank, right? You never get to participate in the governance of a bank. You might get to, listen to the chairman, do an annual meeting once a year and find out a little bit about the bank then, or you may be able to look at a financial statement if you've got that kind of knowledge. But here you can have you can see on the forum all of the questions, how they're being answered. You can meet the members of the core team, on governance calls. You can ask them questions. It's an open and transparent environment that you will never have in TradFi.
Fair. Now I'm almost sold on DeFi, but there's still some part that I want to kind of break apart, right?
Yeah.
So I agree. It sounds like DeFi really brings that speed at scale. But if you look at DeFi, no one really starts out just as a pure DeFi project, right?
Yeah,
Everyone has to start out centralized somewhere. You just need a core group of people who I believe have the right motivations. I mean, Centrifuge is the OG RWA protocol out there, but likewise, right? You didn't start out by being an entirely decentralized community.
Right.
The biggest challenge I see it takes a lot of time, and it's difficult to truly make the decentralized part come true. Right? At the end of the day, you still need a core team like yourself, your incredible team that you have. But then the question is, how D is the DeFi?
Yeah, well, that's a great question.
Yeah.
We didn't really. I have to agree with you. So because I do think that DeFi can be very trustworthy, but you do have to have the D in DeFi first. And there are a lot of DAOs and projects out there that are, in my view, far too centralized. There are too many tokens held by too few people to have a real kind of diffuse and democratized governance that we all hope the DAOs will have. It does take time, and it can change over time, right? Even projects that do fully decentralized can become undecentralized if the tokens get concentrated in too few hands, or there's too much collusion between the main token holders and how they vote. So, I think that DeFi at its best can be better than TradFi, but DeFi at its worst, well, maybe then not so much.
Yeah. Maybe, from the TradFi perspective, and I would say this is less TradFi, but or more of the off-chain world, I think the way we think about this, it's at the end of the day, there will be winners and losers. There will be people who make money and people who don't make money.
Yes.
But I think the way our current off-chain systems work, we have things like taxation, right? And I think tax is it's not a full equalizer of wealth, but the idea is if you make more money, whether you're an individual or you're corporate, we tax you higher, and what those tax dollars are presumably used for, it's to serve the bottom layers, right?
That's right.
So the question is, for this to happen, do you think we need a DeFi tax?
DeFi tax. I think we're going to get we have a DeFi tax. I don't think we get away from the tax authorities. As I said, there may be people who think that this is the wild, wild west, but it's really not the wild, wild west. As a lawyer, there's still legal structures that everybody needs to operate in. We are still operating in particular jurisdictions, and we live in particular countries, and we have to pay our taxes in those countries. So, I think really DeFi is not it's a hybrid system. It has a lot of elements of the TradFi system built in, although not to the full level of a regulated environment.
Very nice. Well, we're almost at time, but maybe the last kind of area I want to talk about, it's, the way I see TradFi and DeFi is very similar to how TradFi and FinTech came together maybe 1 or 2 decades ago, right? Everyone was saying FinTechs would eat the banks and banks would die off, but clearly that hasn't happened, right? You have fintechs that coexist alongside banks, and both start to look a lot more like each other. Fintechs are pursuing bank charters, banks are setting up fintech startups. But I think the true conundrum I have is, if we ask all ourselves where our money is, at least for myself, the majority of it is still in TradFi. Right. It's not even in fintechs, right? Fintechs, sure, all of us have wallets on our phones, but we top up maybe 100, 200, at most $1,000. I'll be surprised if all of us have more than like a 5-figure sum in a single fintech app, but we wouldn't hesitate to put the vast majority of our assets with TradFi. So do you think that this is going to be what the case is for TradFi versus DeFi? That, look, okay, both are going to coexist side by side, but sorry, right? DeFi is just always going to have 10 cents of every dollar that I have.
No, I don't think so. I think they will be in existence together for quite some time. I think that TradFi and DeFi will be more integrated, but you'll always have a spectrum of institutions that are more fully DeFi or more fully democratized, and ones that are completely, TradFi with no Web3 rails at all, and the whole spectrum of things in between. But I would say this: I think that one of the primary reasons why you see a lot of people still hold most of their assets in TradFi is because of deposit insurance, right? I think insurance is going to be a key to moving things forward in the DeFi space. I don't think it's going to happen. It's not going to be forced to happen by a regulator, but I do think that there's going to be a number of DeFi protocols that are already thinking about different types of insurance arrangements that will help. And I think that once those are really in place and trusted, you'll see people much more comfortable with using DeFi. It's still very early.
It is early. So maybe I will ask for your closing remarks, and I'll give you a time to think while I'll go first, right?
Okay, thanks.
Look, the way I think about it for TradFi versus DeFi, it's at the end of the day, both will exist side by side, and both will come together a lot more than we think. But the key phrase that is in my mind, it's at first very slowly, and then all at once. So I'll say that again, at first very slowly, then all at once. So I think, it's going to look like we're not progressing. We're going to take 2 steps forward, 3 steps back with all of these developments. But then I think there will come a point when we hit the inflection point, and then all at once, right? We would just embrace this as a natural part of our life, just as how we embrace fintech in our life. So first slowly, then all at once.
Yeah, I think that's a good, I actually really agree with that statement. I think that what we need to do in the space is there's a whole series of different features of the TradFi arrangements that we really haven't built out yet in a full way. So the whole ecosystem around the traditional financial arrangements need to be in a way replicated one way or another, either by DAOs or by service providers to DAOs, or be streamlined so we don't need those intermediaries anymore. But you need the full range of ecosystem players, and we don't yet have that in a way. And everybody here is working on those projects, and where it's all up to us to figure out how to do this and how to make it work. And I think if you look around these rooms that I go to here in Bangkok, or next week in Dubai, or in New York at DAS a couple of weeks ago, there are so many smart people in this space. There is so much energy and so many people thinking about all of these problems and trying to find ways to fix the problems. I think we're going to get there. I'm sure we're going to get there. I don't, maybe 5 years, but it's going to be there, and then maybe we'll be all at once.
We'll get there. And I think at this point, there's no better way for me to wrap up this time than to thank the hard work you and your team have done. Because for context, Centrifuge was the first ever RWA protocol that came up even before RWA was a term. So thank you for all the work that you and your team have done, and we look forward to see more of it.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting the event, because these are also very important.
Thank you.